Ladies and gentlemen, let us begin the second session of the 9th International Arctic Shipping Seminar. The second session is about Arctic shipping infrastructure and environment. We have speakers from Canada, Russia, and Iceland. The second session will be moderated by Mr. Ho-Chul Bork, who is the Vice President of Global Port Authority. Please welcome him with a big round of applause. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Ho-Chul Bork of Busan Port Authority. This session is about Arctic shipping infrastructure, and we will take a look at the current status of the infrastructure and how to develop the infrastructure. The session will go on for the next 70 minutes or so. The three speakers, luckily, are well versed in this area. They are in the field, and before I joined the session, I went through the presentation materials. I came to see that they are quite practical and up to date. And the theme of this seminar is the past, present, and future of the Arctic shipping route. And I think the three presentations are well aligned with the overall title and the theme of the seminar. We have three speakers. And the first speaker is Mr. Drummond Fraser, who is a Maritime Safety Policy Advisor of Transport Canada. And his presentation will be followed by Mr. Mikhail Belkin, who is a State Policy Director of Rosatom of Russia. And last but not least, we will have the presentation to be delivered by Mr. Hafstein Helgason, who is the Director of Business Development and R&D EFLA of Iceland. And if you have any questions, please save them until the end of all presentations. Let us start with the first presentation by Mr. Drummond Fraser.
Good afternoon, colleagues. My name is Drummond Fraser, and I'm a Senior Policy Advisor at Transport Canada within the Marine Safety and Security branch. I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes or so talking to you today about planning a voyage and navigating the Northwest Passage, and it's my hope that this will provide an interesting counterpoint to the discussions surrounding the Northern Sea Route. Before I get into any of the nuances or the specificities or the things that make Canada's Arctic shipping regime perhaps a little bit unique, I think it's important to provide a little bit of context, as simple as this may be. So, what are Canada's Arctic waters? Well, they're defined in the Arctic Waters Pollution Prevention Act. And the definition sets out those areas north of 60 degrees north and out to the extent of Canada's exclusive economic zone. And that extent is noted in the image on your left that's highlighted in pink. Now, what's not highlighted, but what's equally important to be made aware of, is that the network of islands that together comprise Canada's Arctic archipelago are also the internal waters of Canada, and accordingly subject to Canada's complete sovereign and unfettered control. Those waterways also comprise what are often referred to as the Northwest Passage or even the Northwest Passages. It's important to note here as well that there's no one definition of the Northwest Passage. Instead, it is a series of routes, upwards of 6, 7, 8, that meander through this archipelago, connecting the Atlantic to the Pacific Oceans. Canada's Arctic shipping regime is rooted in the Law of the Sea Convention. Indeed, its pollution prevention regime is linked very closely to Article 234 of the Law of the Sea Convention on ice-covered areas, which set forward pollution prevention regimes seaward of the baselines. I'll also note that the geographic scope of Canada's Arctic waters is also encompassed within the definition of the Arctic as set out under the International Maritime Organization's Polar Code. I had already mentioned that the definition of Canada's Arctic is set out in the Arctic Act, or the Arctic Waters Pollution Prevention Act, which was established in 1970. So Canada has close to 50 years of experience in regulating its Arctic waters. The Arctic Act was and remains unique for a host of reasons, not least of which is the very upfront recognition that the Arctic, Canadian Arctic specifically, is a homeland to generations of Inuit. And that it is also a region with a very unique ecological balance. And these are two sort of tenets that run central throughout Canada's Arctic shipping legislation and regulation. In 2017, when the International Polar Code entered into force internationally, Canada's Arctic shipping regime received a significant overhaul to reflect, in many cases, the negotiations that happened at the international level. I'd also like to flag the fact that Canada's Arctic shipping regime does not occur in a vacuum. In other words, the provisions that are set forward are very much linked to the operational realities of shipping in the north, of shipping at distances remote from shore-based facilities, of shipping at high latitudes, of shipping in difficult ice conditions. So there are a variety of very specific and or unique hazards that together account for the realities of shipping in the Arctic. You can see a list of some of them to the left of this slide. And indeed, these are hazards and associated risks that are set out in the earlier chapters of the Polar Code. Over the next couple of slides, I'm going to now just dig a little bit deeper into a handful of some unique provisions that mariners, that seafarers should be made aware of when operating within Canada's Arctic. And those provisions include a suite of operational methodologies, reporting requirements, and heightened pollution prevention provisions. The first ice operation methodology that I'd like to draw your attention to is one of the oldest, and it's called the zone date system. And I can concede that the images on your right are probably quite difficult to discern, but I'll do my best to explain it. What the zone date system does is it effectively carves the Canadian Arctic up into 16 discrete zones that are based on historical ice conditions, with Zone 1 having a greater degree of ice concentration, a more difficult ice regime, if you will, and Zone 16 having lower degrees of ice concentration. Accompanying that image with the 16 polygons is a table. And again, a modified version of that table is on the screen in front of you. And what that table does, it establishes a range of vessel ice classes and identifies specific times of the year when vessels built to a particular ice class can operate within any one of the 16 identified zones. So again, these two, the table and the map, are meant to be used together. The zone date system is a useful tool largely for voyage planning. It's because it has drawbacks in that this is a static system. It's not dynamic. It is not reflective of actual prevailing ice conditions. But for the purposes of getting a general sense of the type of vessel that you're looking to operate, you can get a good appreciation for where within the Canadian Arctic you can go. The second ice operation methodology that I'd like to draw your attention to is called the Arctic Ice Regime Shipping System, or AIRS. In the context of Canada's Arctic shipping regime, this system is applicable to any vessel that's built before the 1st of January 2017 that's operating outside of the allowable dates of the zone date system. It's also applicable to vessels that are not built to a polar class. The underlying principle of the AIRS system is essentially an evaluation of risks posed to the vessel by prevailing ice conditions. And in order to determine the prevailing ice conditions, the AIRS system requires that trained personnel be on board the vessel who are able to identify ice regimes based on, again, visual observations, aerial reconnaissance, reviewing of ice charts, any number of variable inputs. AIRS is essentially a very simple calculation wherein what's called an ice numeral is generated at the end of performing that calculation. And if that ice numeral is positive, then the vessel is deemed appropriate to be operating within the ice regime and may proceed accordingly. Whereas if the ice numeral comes out as negative, then the captain needs to reevaluate its position in ice, and that could take on the form of requesting ice escort or taking an alternate route altogether. In order to generate an ice numeral, you need what's called an ice multiplier, and there is a standard within the Government of Canada that sets out the range of unique ice multipliers that are assigned to different types of ice regimes and different types of vessels based on their degree of ice strengthening. So the image on the right is really just a performance of a simple ice numeral calculation. And again, here is the table of AIRS ice multipliers that I had mentioned in the previous slide. It's inclusive of vessels built to sort of extreme levels of ice strengthening, Polar Class 1 being at the top of the pile, whereas it's also inclusive of vessels that don't have any degree of ice strengthening, which are, in the case of this regime, considered a Type E vessel. The third and final ice operation methodology that I will describe is called the Polar Operational Limit Assessment Risk Indexing System, or POLARIS. Now, this is a methodology that is supported, if you will, by the International Maritime Organization. A circular was issued about 4 years or so ago that referenced POLARIS as an example of an appropriate ice operation methodology to use in the context of the Polar Code. So what Canada has done is effectively incorporated this regime into its domestic regime and has said that any vessel that is built after the 1st of January 2017 must use POLARIS, again, if operating outside of the allowable dates of the zone date system, or any vessel that has been assigned an IAX polar class must use POLARIS. Now, POLARIS uses World Meteorological Organization nomenclature and builds upon both the AIRS and the Russian ice passport systems. And much like AIRS, a simple calculation is performed wherein rather than an ice numeral, what you are presented with is what's called a risk index outcome. And depending upon the numerical value of this risk index outcome, that determines the type of operation that should occur. So you'll note there's a small table on the bottom right-hand side of this slide. This is actually reflective of Canadian regulation, and I think it's worthwhile just to quickly highlight. And that notes that if your RIO is greater than 0 and you are of a PC3 to PC7 class, you may proceed as you would otherwise normally. Same thing with vessels built to any other ice class. If, however, your RIO is between 0 and -10, then PC3 to PC7 class vessels must proceed with what's called elevated operational risk and be subject to any unique provisions set out in the vessel's unique Polar Waters Operational Manual. And that could be anything from speed reduction, for example. However, for other vessels that are not built to a PC class, if the RIO is between -10 and 0, then they are denied entry. And for all vessels, if the RIO is below -10, there's also no entry. Now, much like ARIS, Polaris has a table of risk index values, and you can see that modified version on the slide in front of you. Another unique provision of Canada's Arctic shipping regime is the Northern Canada Vessel Traffic Service Zone, or NORDREG as it's referred to in its shorthand. NORDREG is a system whereby vessels must report to the Canadian Coast Guard upon entry into the Canadian Arctic. Indeed, the geographical range covered by NORDREG is actually a little bit larger than the definition of Canada's Arctic, in that it also extends to include the entirety of Hudson Bay, as well as James Bay and Ungava Bay in northern Quebec. NORDREG, in addition to requiring advance notice, also requires daily reports, as well as sort of a suite of other reporting conditions based on the type of vessel and the type of activity that the vessel is engaged in. In exchange, the Canadian Coast Guard does provide the vessel with the most current ice information, domain awareness information, proximity to Coast Guard assets. So it is a bit of a two-way street. The last element of Canada's Arctic regime that I would like to make mention of concerns the heightened pollution prevention requirements. Now, the Arctic Waters Pollution Prevention Act sets forward a complete or zero discharge regime on ship source pollutants from entering the water column of Canada's Arctic, except where authorized by regulation. So, under the Arctic Shipping Safety and Pollution Prevention Regulations, a number of the elements of Part 2 of the Polar Code that concern pollution prevention have been brought into force domestically, though not all. Indeed, under Canada's regime, the environmental provisions are even more restrictive than what the Polar Code sets out. So, sewage, for example, may be discharged provided it is treated and provided it is done at set distances from ice. The sewage discharge allowances under the Canadian regime extend to include all types of vessels, not just vessels that are certified in accordance with the appropriate MARPOL annex. Similarly, allowances for discharge are only granted if the garbage is organic and disposed of at certain discharges from ice. And once again, it's applicable to all types of vessels, not just those that are subject to the appropriate MARPOL annex. I'd like to quickly turn away from some of the roles and responsibilities that Transport Canada has as a federal government regulator in the Arctic, and focus my remaining few slides on some of the additional federal government departments and agencies in Canada that have roles and responsibilities for Arctic shipping, not least of which is, of course, the Canadian Coast Guard. Now, I do not claim to speak on behalf of or represent the Coast Guard, but I would certainly be remiss if I did not draw attention to the good work that they do. Program activities include icebreaking, marine communications and traffic services, aids to navigation, as well as incident management, which includes search and rescue and environmental response. This past summer Arctic shipping season saw the deployment of 8 Canadian Coast Guard icebreakers into the Canadian Arctic. You can see their departure and return dates, as well as the number of days spent in the Canadian Arctic and the types of programs that they were engaged in on the slide in front of you. You'll note that the departure and return dates generally reflect the summer Arctic shipping season in Canada, So from late June, early July, through till mid to late October, although the last Canadian Coast Guard icebreaker to depart the Arctic was on the 11th of November. This second Canadian Coast Guard slide provides an illustration of Canadian Coast Guard Auxiliary Unit stations and proposed stations on the left-hand image. On the right-hand, pardon me, are two tables that are drawn from NORDRAG reporting data from 2019 and 2020. The top table provides a high-level impression of the number of individual ships that operated in the Canadian Arctic this year and the number of individual voyages that were undertaken by these ships. And you'll note that there was a significant decrease in both from the previous year. You'll also note that in 2019, the number of Northwest Passage transits was at 28. And in 2020, that had decreased significantly, over 70%, down to only 8 transits. This can be attributed to a variety of reasons, not least of which was the Canadian government's prohibition on both pleasure craft and passenger vessels from operating within the Canadian Arctic during the summer months on account of an abundance of caution for reduction in spread of COVID-19. You'll also note that in the table below, which provides a breakdown of all the individual types of vessels that operate in the Canadian Arctic, that the significant majority are bulk carriers, and those are bulk carriers that are transiting in and out of the Baffinland or Mary River iron ore mine in northern Baffin Island. And second to those bulk carriers are fishing vessels, again, the majority of which are located in the Eastern Arctic, operating between Baffin Island and Greenland in the Baffin Bay-Davis Strait area. I'd also like to quickly draw attention to the Canadian Ice Service. Canadian Ice Service provides a range of services to mariners throughout the entirety of Canada. But in the Canadian Arctic, they provide nowcast and forecast ice and iceberg information 365 days of the year. They also engage in monitoring of Canadian Arctic waters for pollution incidents using satellite data. There are 4 images on the right-hand side of this slide, which are weekly, a composite of weekly ice charts issued in early June and early September. And you'll note that the top 2 images of the Eastern Arctic provide you with an impression of, again, ice at the beginning of the season and ice at the end of the season. So there's a reasonably significant reduction, though the waters aren't ice-free. Now, compare that to the bottom 2 images of the Western Canadian Arctic in and around the Beaufort Gyre, and you'll see that middle of June, there are significant concentrations of ice that persist. And fast forward through to the middle of September, while ice along the coast has receded, there nevertheless remains significant concentrations of ice along Banks Island, along much of the Western Arctic archipelago. And indeed, when you look at some of the notable events from this past summer, in both the eastern, western, and southern approaches to the Canadian Arctic, ice melt was earlier and freeze up was delayed. So this is representative of a general trend that we tend to see within the Canadian Arctic, though certainly there are aberrations and anomalies in any given year. The final federal government organization with involvement in the Canadian Arctic that I'd like to draw your attention to is the Canadian Hydrographic Service, who are responsible for, amongst other things, charting and bathymetric work, not just within the Arctic, but on all 3 of Canada's coasts and internal waterways. And this is a bit of a daunting task, particularly when you look at the Canadian Arctic and the entire continent of Europe can fit nicely over top the Arctic archipelago, and there would still be room to spare. So it's quite a significant geographic range of waterways that need to be charted. So in order to try to prioritize efforts, given limited assets, the Canadian government has embarked upon a concept of identifying low impact shipping corridors. And these corridors are in turn ranked according to a range of criteria, to primary, secondary, tertiary, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You can see the eastern Canadian Arctic in the image on the left, and those areas that have been designated primary, secondary, tertiary, et cetera. And from 2017, 23% of primary and secondary shipping corridors were charted to modern, which is CATSOC A1 and A2 standards. Whereas in 2020, this summer, that number was brought up to 33%. So a 10% increase in 3 years. The vast majority of bathymetric information comes from the Canadian Coast Guard vessel, the Amundsen, which has been in operation since 2003. And indeed, she's responsible for over 50% of all modern hydrography in the Canadian Arctic. So really a true workhorse. Now, in order to try to address the issue of limited assets and the sheer volume of work that needs to be done, a variety of innovative approaches to acquiring data are being employed, including equipping recreational vessels with qualified multi-beam operators who understand charting standards, as well as employing autonomous vessels to do unmanned bathymetric work. Finally, in conclusion, I'd like to depart with a few remarks. The first of which is that Canada has a robust vessel safety and pollution prevention regime that's rooted in the Law of the Sea Convention. It's a regime that is reflective of International Maritime Organization Convention and one that's tailored to the unique hazards and the associated risks of vessel operations in Canada's north. It's also a regime that recognizes the rights of local Inuit who've called the Arctic home for generations. Indeed, Canada welcomes navigation in its Arctic waterways, provided vessels comply with rules related to safety, security, and pollution prevention, a number of which I've flagged and highlighted during the earlier half of this presentation. It's my personal view that despite advances in ship technology and despite a general trend of reduction in sea ice extent and thickness, particularly in the shoulder seasons of the Canadian Arctic summer, the Canadian Arctic will continue to pose unique risks to mariners, which serves to underscore the critical importance of training, particularly for those who are unfamiliar with Arctic operations. Also, vis-a-vis the Northern Sea route, Canadian Arctic shipping numbers are generally lower. Canadian Arctic shipping generally is associated with what's called destination shipping. So it is vessels that are departing ports south of 60 degrees north and entering ports north of 60 degrees north to carry out a number of activities, including resupplying local communities with food and fuel, providing services to local mine sites, engaging in fishing activity. And it's not so much vessels using the Northwest Passage or Northwest Passages as a transit route or a shortcut between the Atlantic and the Pacific. Certainly that's not what we're seeing in the numbers reported. And then finally, the 2020 Arctic shipping season was very much a unique one on account of the global COVID-19 pandemic, with temporary prohibitions having been put in place that have all but limited passenger vessel and recreational vessel activity from occurring within the Canadian Arctic. It's effectively limited or postponed virtually all research activity, vessel-based research activity in the Canadian Arctic. And these prohibitions are currently in place until further notice. So 2021 could very well be a different year. So with that, I'd like to conclude and thank you very much for your patience.
Well, once again, please give big hand to the presenter. Well, I believe Mr. Fraser could not hear the big applause here in Busan, but it was really insightful and interesting presentation. A lot of valuable information shared. Thank you very much. So, hearing the presentation, in particular in the conclusion, well, I was planning to give some comments, but well, it was really realistic data and information he shared with us. If you look at the fourth, the Northwest Passage, the data he shared with us mostly. Well, the vessels are traveled between the Northwest Passage. The destinations are almost always Canada, so I mean it's not via Canada to US and other destinations. So as you already know, in the year 2020, due to the COVID-19 pandemic and other reasons, there's a prohibition of transportation or navigation of cruise vessels and recreational vessels and others. So, including myself and others, are very interested in the NSR in the last part of the presentation and to secure the safe navigation of vessels in the ice water. The four measures taken by the Canada Transportation Authority so obviously shows that how scientific and systematic the measures are implemented by the Canadian authority. And all the detailed information, and maybe you can clearly refer to, but the shipping companies actually working or operating in the NSR, the ZDSR, and Polaris, Aris, and other items and systems already in place in the Canadian, Arctic route. I think it will be quite helpful to take them into account. Once again, thank you very much, Mr. Fraser. And we are moving on to the second presentation of the session 2. That is about Northern Sea route, current and future development. The speaker is Mr. Mikhail Balkin. He's the State Policy Director of Rosatom in Russia. I think I remember his face, so that means that he has participated in the seminar for several years. One of the regular speakers, I'm not sure he can see us, but please give a big hand to Mr. Balkin.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, good day. First of all, I am very glad to participate in the International Arctic Shipping Seminar again. The seminar now has almost 10-year history and proved to be ground for professional discussion of questions related to shipping in high latitudes, innovative technologies of navigation in ice conditions, rapid growth of economic significance of the Arctic, and ways to preserve its fragile nature. Representatives of business, science, shipbuilding industry will be sharing their views on the development of Arctic maritime routes for safe and sustainable navigation. I would like to thank the organizers of the seminar that they managed to host it despite the pandemic of COVID-19. Let's just hope that we shall be able to meet at the 10th anniversary seminar in person as usual. The topic of my presentation is Northern Sea route, current and future development. And I am going to speak about the recent changes in Russian legislation in the sphere of Arctic in general and the Northern Sea route in particular. The development of the atomic icebreaking fleet as the key element to safe and sustainable navigation of the Northern Sea route will also be mentioned. In the year 2018, the state corporation Rosatom was awarded the status of the infrastructural operator of the Northern Sea route. Here on the map, the Northern Sea route boundaries are shown according to Russian legislation and marked light blue. The Northern Sea route includes the Kara Sea, the Laptev Sea, the East Siberian Sea, and the Chukchi Sea, and lies within Russian exclusive economic zone. There are two Rosatom companies that operate on the Northern Sea route constantly. This is the operator of the state-owned atomic icebreaking fleet, Rosatomflot, based in Murmansk, and Hydrographic Enterprise, based in St. Petersburg, that produces hydrographic measurements of depths on the NSR and builds state-owned infrastructure of maritime ports. Rosatom also has plans to realize a number of commercial projects related to the Northern Sea route shipping, which will be launched in the nearest future. Rosatom, together with several federal ministries, governments of Arctic regions of Russia, and commercial companies that do business on the Northern Sea Route developed the Northern Sea Route Infrastructure Development Plan till the year 2035. The plan was adopted by the order of the government of Russia. The plan suggests 3 stages of the Northern Sea Route development. Stage 1 is dedicated to the accelerated development of the western part of the Northern Sea Route in 2019-2024. The Northern Sea Route development at this stage is aimed at the results stated in the decree of the President of Russian Federation dated May 7, 2018. Stage 2 is devoted to the organization of the year-round navigation via all the Northern Sea Route in 2025-2030. After the tasks of this stage are fulfilled by 2030, the Northern Sea Route will become a year-round transportation system, which provides for basic needs of the route's transport services consumers. Stage 3 is dedicated to establishing a competitive international and national transport corridor based on the Northern Sea Route in 2030-2035. By the end of the year 2035, the Northern Sea Route will become the basic element of a competitive international and national maritime transport corridor, capable to meet any needs of the consumers of transport and logistics services. I would like to mention that the international transit navigation via the Northern Sea Route keeps growing. This year, the total volume of transit shipping via the Northern Sea Route is above 1.2 million tons, which is almost twice more than previous year. More than 70 commercial vessels, many of them are 75,000 tons deadweight and more, use the opportunity for faster passage from Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean and vice versa that the Northern Sea Route provides. The plan has 84 activities, which are divided into 11 sections. While preparing the plan, we tried hard to take into account all main spheres of the development of an international maritime seaway to the corresponding standards. The plan thus covers not only commercial issues, but also safety of navigation, communication, modern technologies, weather conditions monitoring, ecology, energy production, and so on. Here is the list of all sections that are included into the Northern Sea Route Infrastructure Development Plan. There are activities aimed at the development of seaports and terminals. Activities aimed at the development of emergency response and rescue and auxiliary fleet. Activities aimed at the development of navigational and hydrographic services of navigation on the Northern Sea Route. It is the absolute must for the heavy tonnage vessels with deep draft to have confirmed fairways where they can keep good commercial speed. Activities aimed at the development of ice-breaking fleet, without which the year-round navigation will not be possible at all. Activities aimed at stimulating the development of cargo traffic and international transit navigation via the Northern Sea Route, including construction of maritime logistics centers. Activities aimed at the development of air and railroad infrastructure to provide cargo base for the Northern Sea Route. Further sections are dedicated to activities aimed at the provision of the safety of navigation and stable communication on the Northern Sea Route. Activities aimed at the development of power production facilities that support the infrastructure of the Northern Sea Route. Activities aimed at the medical provision and personnel training to support the development of the Northern Sea Route infrastructure. Specific Arctic conditions, especially when navigating in ice-covered waters, require special knowledge and training of a master and his crew. Activities aimed at the development of national shipbuilding industry to provide for the needs of Arctic navigation. Activities aimed at the ecological safety of the Northern Sea Route. As I mentioned before, Preserving the fragile ecology of Arctic when major resource extraction projects are launched and the number of vessels transporting their products is growing exponentially is the priority issue. In October 2020, the strategy for the development of the Arctic zone of the Russian Federation and national security up to 2035 was adopted by the decree of the President of Russian Federation. The strategy comprises main statistical data, problematic issues, directions for the development of the Arctic zone of Russia, and details on particular steps. The document covers many aspects of Russian Arctic, like regional and local living conditions, commodities, industry, transport, security, ecology, availability of public services, and so on. Many of these aspects, the strategy connects directly to the Northern Sea route. The very first article says that the special approach to social and economic development of the Arctic zone is determined by the strong geographical, historical, and economic connection with the Northern Sea route. It also states the significance of the Northern Sea route as a transport corridor of world scale used to transport national and international cargoes. The traffic through the Northern Sea route rose from 4 million tons in 2014 to 31.5 million tons in 2019. At the very same time, the strategy says that the pace of the development of infrastructure is slower than that of economic development. But this is exactly what the plan for the infrastructural development, which was described earlier, is meant to solve. The strategy is divided into 3 stages: from 2020 to 2024, from 2025 to 2030, from 2030 to 2035, and contains elements incorporated into the Northern Sea Route Development Plan. The map on the right side of the slide shows the areas that comprise the Arctic zone of Russia. In September 2020, the new rules of navigation on the Northern Sea Route were adopted by the decree of the government of Russia. The new rules of navigation on the Northern Sea Route specify the role of the Maritime Operations Headquarters, which is set up by the state corporation Rosatom, in order to organize the navigation on the Northern Sea Route. The Maritime Operations Headquarters is run by Atomflot in Murmansk. The headquarters provide the following services: icebreaking assistance to vessels navigating the Northern Sea Route, information services to vessels navigating Northern Sea Route, navigation routing on the Northern Sea Route. The headquarters also positions icebreakers on the Northern Sea Route and approves permissions for navigating the Northern Sea Route, which are applied to the administration of the Northern Sea Route of the Ministry of Transport of Russia. The headquarters processes data received from satellites, meteorological stations, icebreakers, and commercial vessels, and then provides recommendations to the vessels. The headquarters has the proprietary automatic managing system, which is used to organize the navigation on the Northern Sea Route. This system is upgraded based on the latest technological and digital solutions. The rules also contain some changes to the requirements to the vessels navigating the Northern Sea Route. On the right side of the slide, there is a picture of the maritime headquarters of Atomflot in Murmansk. On this slide, you can see the schedule of new atomic icebreakers commissioning. All icebreakers on this slide are already under construction, except for the first universal atomic icebreaker Arctica, the upper one, which is already commissioned. So now we have 5 atomic icebreakers in operation, including the first universal icebreaker of 60 MW propulsion power. The other 4 universal icebreakers will be delivered in the upcoming years, with the last one scheduled in 2026. At the very same time, the atomic icebreakers that are operated now will gradually be put out of service due to run out of power plant resource, apart from 50 Лет Победы icebreaker, which was commissioned in 2007 and is still quite young. Just to remind that they are called universal icebreakers because they can change their working draft and can operate both in deep and shallow waters. In 2027, the first atomic icebreaker of leader type will be commissioned. This icebreaker will be the most powerful one ever constructed, with a propulsion power of 120 megawatts and icebreaking capability of 4 meters. The leader type icebreaker is scheduled to operate in the eastern part of the Northern Sea route, where ice conditions are traditionally much harder compared to the western part, the Kara Sea. This icebreaker, together with the universal atomic icebreakers, will ensure the stable navigation through the eastern part of the Northern Sea route on the year-round basis, thus making the NSR operational 365 days a year. By 2027, Rosatom will be operating 7 nuclear-powered icebreakers. As I mentioned before, the first universal atomic icebreaker Arctica in the series of 5 was commissioned on October 21st this year in Murmansk. In this picture you may see this icebreaker in action. The icebreaker is now working on the Northern Sea route and already assisted several cargo vessels. There are several important features that differ this icebreaker from the previous generation. First of all, she is stronger than any other icebreakers operated, 60 megawatts propulsion power. This parameter determines the thickness of ice which the icebreaker can surpass, 3 meters in this case. Previous generation atomic icebreakers limit was 2.3 meters. The ability to rapidly change draft up to 3 meters, called the double draft, allows this icebreaker to operate in heavy ice conditions where bigger mass is required and in shallow waters, like for example Yenisei River. Previously Atomflot could only send 2 out of 4 icebreakers to shallow water areas, and the same proportion was true for heavy ice. Now the universal icebreaker can perform duties in all types of conditions. This icebreaker also has twice less number of crew compared to previous generation icebreakers, due to automation of many operations. This is all that I planned to cover in my presentation. Before I finish my speech, I would like to once again express my sincere gratitude to the organizers of the seminar, especially to the Ministry of Oceans and Fisheries of Korea and the Yonsei University. And I would like to thank the audience for your attention and for your interest towards the Northern Sea route. During the last several years, we have witnessed significant changes of this maritime highway. But this is just a beginning. Should you have questions or comments, please send them to the address shown on this slide. Thank you. Until next time. Goodbye.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mikhail Velkin. He shared with us the Northern Sea route, current and future development in different phases. He mentioned infrastructure several times. And as for the challenges with regard to the infrastructure, would include the ports and harbor in the NSR region. And in case of any accident, well, there is not enough rescue assistance, and the rescue and search center will be built to address that. And last but not least, he mentioned the icebreakers, the assistance of the icebreakers. So those four things will be the main pillars for the infrastructure improvement. He also mentioned 3 different stages for development. Stage 1 would be by 2024, the continuous development of the NSR. And the second stage will be from 2025 to 2030. And that is to complete all the infrastructure construction so that we will have year-round navigation. And in stage 3 or phase 3, from 2030 to 2035, for international shipping transportation, well, that will ensure that the freight will be competitive. So quite an ambitious development plan he just shared with us. And as for nuclear icebreakers, he also elaborated on the plan to provide more nuclear icebreakers. And then probably on the 21st of October this year, I think it was Arctic 7 or something. I think about that, those 6 vessels were built in Korea, so nuclear icebreakers will be continued to be built going forward. And I think you'd agree with me that by when, you'd wonder by when we'll be able to commercially use the NSR and around what time it will be feasible. Many people pose questions about that. Mr. Belkin said that by 2035, we will be able to see year-round navigation via Arctic shipping route. Thank you very much, Mr. Belkin. Now I'd like to turn to our 3rd speaker, who is also the last speaker of this session. And this presentation is on the infrastructure development plan for Arctic container shipping. Mr. Hafstein Helgesen from Iceland, who is the director of EFLA, will deliver his presentation. And I think his presentation is mostly on the PPP project by Finnafjord. Let us give him a big round of applause for his presentation.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for inviting me to have this speech on your interesting conference in Busan in Korea. I'm sorry not be able to participate in person. I would very much like to, but due to the pandemic situation we have on Earth, I have to be at home. But anyhow, today I will tell you a little bit about infrastructure development plan for Arctic container shipping. At least from our point of view, that means from the point of, from our view as developers of the Finnafjord port project. I'm a business development director and director for research and development projects at Epla Consulting Engineers. History tells us it is the best to predict and plan actions based on scientific work. We can see this nowadays in the COVID-19 pandemic, how important this is. And when it comes to prediction regarding Arctic shipping and infrastructure investment, we should do absolutely the same. It is of fundamental importance not only to monitor and to do best to understand changes happening in the Arctic. We have to undergo those changes. We have to stay in the area, feel these changes on our own skin. And therefore, only projects when you involve local people, local governance, local engineering and design offices, local people into your projects, that is the only way to succeed. The German Mosaic expedition, which was mainly ongoing last winter, as the Polarstern, the icebreaker Polarstern from Germany, was staying over winter time in the polar ice shield, close to the North Pole itself, with scientists from many nations doing research work. We saw how much things are in movement. The ice there was thinner than planned. All over water to sea, cracks to sea. They had to move measurement equipment due to movement of the ice. They lost part of their equipment. And this is all happening now and happening very fast. This is all about energy flows. And to understand this situation and to have a good understanding of the future, we have to know what is happening in this area. And first we should know that warmer water will rise, is lighter than not warm water. And salinity in the sea water makes water more heavy than water without salt. And we have here in the North Atlantic, we have the 10,000 kilometer long Gulf Stream bringing energy up to the north. We are talking about a flow of 100 million cubic meters per second, and the speed is around 2 meters per second in average. This is changing everything. And the energy in this flow is equivalent to energy from 1 million nuclear power plants. And of course, when so big part of the ocean is in movement and goes up to the north, something has to go towards south. And that is the cold current, which goes from the north down to the south in the deeper sea, let's say. And that is happening between Iceland and Greenland and Iceland and Norway. This is, so to say, a largest waterfall on Earth, something with 15 kilometers wide stream and 4 kilometers steep stream. And is, of course, pulling up then the hot and the warm sea up towards the north. This is, so to say, a machine. And in the summertime, we have higher air temperatures in the area, but we still have the warm sea. And from underneath, the ice is melting much, much faster than melting from the surface through the warm air. And then in the summertime, we have winds blowing from east to west, normally in the pole area, and we have the currents rotating the ice in the polar area. That means we have the oldest ice, ice we call multi-year-old ice. We have that stored up in the northeast part of Greenland and northeast part of Canada. And when the polar ice cap and the glacier of Greenland will melt, of course, salinity of the water will change. It will fall. And the density of the seawater will also change. It will go down. And the Gulf Stream may, therefore, go into some kind of a slow motion or could even come to a stop. But those climate changes, Earth now, really, we do measure this, may compensate that effect. So this will take this, let's say, warm period will maybe take longer time than normally. But if the Gulf current comes to a stop or goes to a slow movement, then we will have an ice age here up in the north. How deep the sea is under the ice in the polar area. You can see that on the map here. And you can see that towards northeast from Greenland, there is a rather narrow corridor connecting this central pole area with the North Atlantic area. And there, the big cold flow goes towards south. We will see ice-free times during summer, and those summer, they will be longer in future, maybe up to 6 months. Thin ice is now in the area during winter times, but the ice may be thinner in future. And of course, when all the ice is disappearing from this ocean north in the North Pole area, then we will see around 9 million square kilometer territory of open. And of course, then we have new shipping routes, and that is going to be a reality. We only don't know when this is going to happen. And of course, when this will happen, infrastructure will be needed, harbors will be built, airfields, roads, power plants. And at the same time, we will have access to new resources. Take a look at the Greenland. The Greenland is an upcoming mining country, maybe one of the largest on Earth in future. And Canada is also rich on ore. And we will also see new fishing grounds. Sure. And during the Mosaic exhibition, they even managed to catch cod during the winter time under the ice. And that was something they didn't expect. And of course, due to all those activities we will see in the next, this century in the Arctic, we will of course see the population growth there. We have now within the Arctic Circle around 7 million people living, but that will change. That means those people, they will need food, they will need fuel, and they have to be able to travel. So there is a lot of new movement going to happen. Vessel owners and operators, they try normally to avoid situations like you can see here on this slide. Drifting ice, or ice blocks of the size of islands, and those you cannot see on the radar. High waves and rough sea, high wind speeds, cold climate and low temperatures, fog, and all this can make your voyage more difficult. It is maybe more difficult to navigate through ice-free area in the cold north during wintertime with all the fog and also ice from time to time in the area instead of going through thin ice the whole route. It is quite tough. And investors, they like to avoid situations as you can see here on this slide. Limited lowland for building up airstrips, permafrost all over, steep and rocky mountains. You have maybe a very deep fjord, but no lowland. Remote areas and darkness all the day, all the night. Mosquitoes, all over mosquitoes. Poor level of education and social problems within the population of those smaller villages all over the Arctic. And of course, lack of infrastructure. So it's hard to start. All projects in the Arctic are more expensive than in the south part of the Atlantic. I will now bring you to our project site in Finnafjord in the northeast of Iceland. As you can see from the red circle, it is on the south side of the 45-kilometer long peninsula there. And that peninsula is protecting this fjord from north winds and waves. You can also see that we have glaciers in Iceland, by the way, the largest glacier in Europe. And the whole sea all around Iceland is all the year round ice-free. This photo was taken from a plane in the year of 2014, It is ice-free site all the year around and almost no snow on the lowland. We have been operating wind measurement stations there and weather stations since many years, and we see speeds in the shore area, and normally very, very clear wind directions. And the temperature is rather mild, it's neither mild climate there. The average temperature over the year is higher than the average temperature of Manhattan in New York City. So does it look like? It is without trees. It is no permafrost there. It is flat and dry landmass, easy to move, easy to construct. And it is even an ideal site for a full-size landing strip. And that is something we have been thinking about to implement in the project. And that is, of course, absolutely unique to have at the same spot, deep sea port and airport, especially then for cars. The whole landmass is gravel. The gravel is pure. It is of different size, easy to use for construction, and the quality of the gravel can be used for concrete mix. The shore side is without rock, it is gravel, and the fjord is deep, and the sea is calm. And as you can see, it's very flat and there is almost nobody there. Our view of the development in future is the following. We will see multi-purpose vessels be more in the northern part of the Atlantic and along the Northern Sea route than we have seen in the past. Those multi-purpose vessels, they will bring containers, of course, partly with other goods. This may change after 2035 or 2040 and be a whole year basis, but at least during the summertime, long summertime, that means 6 months, we could operate vessels with high ice class. But the focus during the next years to come will be on the bulk and the break bulk, we believe. And there are a lot of interesting opportunities there. The mining material from Canada or Greenland, all the cars, trucks, trains, timber products, power units, building material, and wind power plants, all this will come with vessels, be moved with vessels. And not forget, we will see new cargo come into the mix. That means ammonia and liquid hydrogen. Ammonia is the future of the for larger, and this is going to start soon, maybe 2026 or earlier maybe. And liquid hydrogen is also an option. And you should know that in the Arctic, we have a lot of renewable energy, and but that is far away from the consumers. But we could produce e-fuels like ammonia there and bring it to the markets. Therefore, a part of the stranded renewable energy in the Arctic will be discovered and utilized. If you take a look at the land, Greenland, with all the ice, you could say that the ice there is the largest battery on Earth, full of energy. And those rivers, all in each and every fjord, there are rivers bringing that liquid water to the sea without generating electricity now. And the wind potential is huge. For instance, in Iceland, close to the Finnafjord project, on the hills there, we have better utility rates onshore than you can see offshore in front of the coastline of Germany and Holland. But of course, the investment cost behind each megawatt hour is lower on land than on sea. And not forget, we will also see much more fish be transported from this area on the demanding markets. Then we are talking about fish from the seas. New ocean will show up, and we will also see more fish farming on land as well in the sea. And we are maybe talking about 5 to 8 million tons plus per year from 10 years from now. So the breakbulk is definitely going to be more than we see today. And of course, with container under deck, because container goods, they have to be protected from the cold. And we will also see ore be transported in the area to the demanding markets. Also special carriers like this one on the left side down. You can see a huge yellow steel construction. It's a fish farming cave taken with a special vessel from COSCO to Norway some years ago. And then, of course, we will see more car carriers go along the northern sea route and the central sea route in future. So this is the Finnafjord south side as we see it. I'm not going to show you the north side, but this is the south side. It's a 5 kilometer long site. On the left, we have the search and rescue and service port. Then we have the mining material coming in smaller portions with smaller vessels from Greenland, maybe from Canada. And then that will be taken out in larger portions on special vessels, huge vessels to the demanding markets. And then in the middle, we have the container terminal. And in combination with the breakbulk terminal. And behind that, we have factories doing all kind of assembly on those bigger units, maybe wind power plants or whatever. Then on the right, land hydrogen and ammonia production on the far right side, and export terminal for liquid ammonia or liquid hydrogen. And this terminal is as well a fuel station for those vessels in future. So the Finnafjord is definitely on the beaten track. It's a hub port and a way port for trans-Arctic container and breakbulk shipping. And this route, the central polar route, is of course very interesting when it comes to the Finnafjord, because that will shorten the way quite a lot. And this is going to be a bulk port, industrial site processing mineral products from Greenland, storing up temporarily material. And this is an Arctic research and rescue port. And of course, site for harnessing 100% renewable energy to produce alternative fuels for the vessels of the future. And of course, as well, proteins for our human being. The PPP model structure is like that for the project. We have on the left side, the municipalities, 2 municipalities, they are cooperating on this project, and they are running the Finnafjord Port Authority, the blue. And on the side, we have the landowners, private farmers, owners of the land. They are living in other areas, and they are renting that land to the concessionaires through the Port Authority. And then we onboard the Red Box as a Finnafjord Port Development Company, together with Bremen Ports, the fourth largest port in Europe, and some investors. We are preparing the project so concessions can be given. And now we are working on social impact study and framework plan and environmental impact assessment study. Basic design guidelines are in preparation for the concessionaires, depending on what kind of terminal they will operate. We do think that between 2022 and 2028, we will be able to tender out the hydrogen and green ammonia production terminal and land-based aquaculture related to that or connected to that territories, let's say. That is of interest because land-based fish farms need a lot of oxygen. And if you are producing hydrogen, you have a lot of oxygen as a byproduct. And then after 2028, we will see a multi-purpose terminal come in operation. And from 2030, the breakbulk terminal will be realized, and maybe earlier, but we say 2030. And we believe that the real container traffic will first start in the year of 2035, maybe even 2040. And after that, or similar to that, we will see the bulk terminal come up, because then Greenland will be a real mining country. A lot of things are going on in Greenland today in this direction. So here we can see those project partners we have on board, the 2 municipalities and the Bremen ports. Thank you so much. And don't hesitate to contact me if you have questions related to the project. Thank you.
Well, once again, it was Mr. Hafstein Helgesund from EFLA in Iceland under the topic of infrastructure development of plan for Arctic container shipping. Well, before we started, I paid a great attention in the beginning as well. Just to remind you, the history told us to predict what kind of actions to be taken scientifically, it's better to actually make plans. So we need to keep in mind, we observed that in the situation of the COVID-19 pandemic, and to predict the infrastructure development in the Arctic region, I think the same methodology should be applied. So what's happening in the Arctic, just simply monitoring and to understand the change, it's not enough for us. We should feel by ourselves, on our skin, the changes. So, as the regular service operator, he shared with us their business, operation direction and the business philosophy. It was quite interesting. Next, he also explained the prospects of the Northern Sea route by year, and at the end of the presentation, and he also shared with us the business plans for the future. So, just to remind you, let me summarize it. If you look at the graphs, it will help you better understand from the city government. Finnafjord, the Port Authority is established, which is 100% owned by the local, government. So obviously that's what we are doing in Busan as well. That's traditional methodology to operate a port. So, and I think it's quite similar to the second point as well, to attract investors. And for the Port of Bremen and EFLA and other local governments, to encourage participation from these stakeholders to develop the port and to designate operator. I think that is the true, methodology to implement PPE. And last but not least, he also shared a roadmap to select the operator and development of the port infrastructure. Now we have all three presentations, and actually we are running about 10 minutes behind the schedule dedicated for the session. I believe that there can be some questions from the floor. I think there is a question it's directed to Mr. Belkin, Milan Belkin. Unfortunately, I do not see him connected online. Well, oh, I see Mr. Belkin at the bottom of the screen.
Hi, sir. Is it okay hearing me?
Well, there's a question directed to Mr. Belkin. I believe an interpretation will be provided. Okay. I think someone from the floor gave this question to Mr. Belkin in the Northern Sea route. It's quite interesting. I think the question is very interesting. In the navigation regulation in the NSR in the past, we believe it was divided into 7 sectors. But the revised navigation regulation in the NSR, according to the revised regulation, it's not 7 sections. It's more than 40 sectors. So when it was announced, I'm not sure, but anyhow, it was quite recently revised. So now we have more than 40 sections in the region. So that means the subsidies for icebreakers and support, etc., what kind of implications it will have. So the question is, the revised regulation, what kind of implication it will have?
Thank you for your question. I hope it's okay with the sound. Do you hear me? Well, I hope that's okay. Thank you very much. That's a good question. First of all, I would like to say that everything which was done recently to the regulations is done to provide a better detailed understanding of how to treat the conditions on the Northern Sea route. Let's say we did not change significantly. I mean, we, Ministry of Transportation, Rosatom, and the government of Russian Federation, of course, because these new rules, they are adopted by the decree of the Russian Federation government. We did not change anything which concerns the process of application for the permission. In order not in any case to hamper the let's say the process of a client applying for the permission. So nothing was done to make it more difficult. Everything instead was done to make it easier for the clients, let's say for the user of the Northern Sea route, let's put it like this, to use Northern Sea route. The idea to divide into more sections, that's to make it easier to plan the navigation via the Northern Sea route, because you know, conditions on the NSR. The NSR is a very big, let's say, area. It's more than 2,000 nautical miles in length, and more than 200 nautical miles, let's say, in width. So the conditions on the NSR are quite different in different areas. And the bigger areas you have, the bigger division you have, the more difficult, the harder it is for you to take into consideration all minor zones where ice conditions may differ. But when you have smaller areas, it's easier to take into account the conditions of these particular areas. So because the ice conditions, the currents, the winds, the temperatures, they can be different in several areas which fall within larger zones. But if you divide them into smaller zones, it's easier to, let's say, it's easier for, first of all, for the customer to plan its voyage. And secondly, for us, for Rosatom, to provide icebreaking support and to provide routing for this vessel. And it's of course easier for the administration of the Northern Sea route to process the application and to issue permission. So in this case, everything is done in order to make it easier for the user of the Northern Sea route to plan its voyage.
Well, I hope the one who asked the question fully understand the question and answer. Okay, I think it's quite enough. Answer the question. All right, and do we have more questions from the floor to other speakers? Okay, we have, from various parts of the world, participants are connected online. It looks like we do not have further questions. Okay. Well, obviously, it's not difficult to say hello to everyone, but at least I'd like to once again extend my appreciation to the three speakers for this session, and we will conclude this session here. But okay. Yes. So joining the Arctic shipping seminar, I feel a lot of the things and have a lot of thoughts. But personally, what I see is that looking at the development of the Northern Sea route, maybe so far we had just really rosy fantasy pictures, because the full openness of the NSR, the significance or the meaning of it, I believe it is one of the most important agendas for the humankind today. And it is certainly based on the climate change. It's not just about climate change. It has really big implications on the daily life of all human population on Earth. So it's almost like watching in a fairy tale, like Cinderella. Is holding a kind of a really delicious-looking apple on her hand. So this is how I feel about the Northern Sea route. Progress, but however, we have possibilities and also some challenges. But certainly, that poses a great challenge for us. A lot of homework to do. So taking one step further, what are we going to select? What kind of options? Are we going to focus on commercial operation, or are we going to focus more on the potential environmental, destruction? Maybe someday we will just, be at the point where we have to make a choice between these two. But until then, I sincerely hope that we will put our heads together, come up with a really, wise and smart solutions for that. Well, do we have a question?
Hi, hello. Yes, I have a question that might be addressed. I was thinking more primarily to Mr. Fraser, but probably to all three speakers. And my question is related to the role of the local populations. You have mentioned in some of your presentations that, of course, it's very important to consider the rights of the indigenous peoples and First Nations. And I was wondering whether you could say a little bit more of the complexity of managing the development of the Arctic, and also the benefits of the developments in the Arctic for the local population. That's very relevant, of course, for Iceland and for Russia as well. But I know this is a very important topic for Canada.
Sure, may I proceed? Can you hear me? Thanks for the question. It's a multi-headed one. I'll do my best to answer it concisely. At the end of the day, the regulation of shipping in Canada is vested in a federal responsibility. But in recognition, as I alluded to in my presentation, of the rights of Inuit within Canada's 3 territories and in the northern parts of a handful of Canadian provinces, the Government of Canada is quite invested in this concept of co-management So that is to involve Inuit in particular in the decision-making process with respect to where shipping should occur, to determine ways in which the potential negative impacts from shipping can be addressed. Right now, as an example, there's a process underway in the eastern approaches to the Northwest Passage to define what's called a National Marine Conservation Area. And this is being done hand in glove with the Inuit to respect their traditional livelihoods. The water and the sea ice is essential for food security. And there's the potential that shipping can interrupt the ability for local populations to meet those food security demands. So I think this would likely require a whole presentation unto itself. It is a complex topic. There are a multitude of legal issues, of social issues. Canada is unique in that its Arctic is not connected to the south by road networks. Everything is either flown in or shipped in. So shipping does kind of take on a whole new identity, if you will. You know, in as much as Canada is trying to develop ways and to sort of further a relationship with locals in the north, it's far from a perfect relationship. So I think that there's certainly work to be done, though I believe, and I'm selfish in saying this, that we are sort of embarking upon the right path forward. Maybe I'll stop there. I know you had a couple other perhaps related questions, but I will afford the opportunity to other panelists to respond if they feel so.
Thank you.
Hafstein Helgason here in Iceland. I could maybe give a short answer to this. Here in Iceland, we are not dealing with the same problems as you are dealing with in Canada. Regarding the project I mentioned, the government of Iceland is supporting that project. Also those two municipalities involved, and all the land along the coastline of Iceland is owned by private people. Only the highland in the center of the country is, so to say, owned by the state. And those owners of the land, they are very pleased to be involved in the project. And you should have in mind that on both sides of the fjord, we have two small fishing villages. And all jobs there, they are quite monotone. Let's say there is a need for new kind of jobs in the area. So a lot of young people, they do not come back to their home after getting education in the south, in the capital. So they are very much pleased to see new opportunities come up with this project. But at the same time, we, as well as the municipalities and the government of Iceland, we are very much concerned about the environmental part of the project. And therefore, we have set up, so to say, rules that each and every vessel must be connected to the electrical grid of Iceland when it is in the port. And we do hope when the port will be, let's say, up and running, then we will see alternative fuels, as I mentioned, as fuel for the vessels. So the project will be indeed very much of interest for the vessel operators, because there they could get fuel on very attractive prices. Thank you.
Well, so far, we have exchanged, comments and questions amongst, the speakers as well. So in Iceland, well, I think it's early in the morning, but in Canada, I believe it's really late at night. And we are having, participants all over the world once again making this seminar really international, gatherings. So now we are running about 20 minutes behind schedule. So we will conclude the session 2 here. Once again, thank you very much for your participation and time. Okay, with this we will conclude session 2, and session 3 will begin at 5:05 Korean time, and we will try our best to wrap up the entire seminar 6 sharp. Thank you very much.